I spent a lot of time in the laboratory. My doctoral program that I was in at Johns Hopkins was in cell and molecular biology. I was fascinated about how things became what they are in developmental biology. The specific research I was doing in the laboratory was on the nucleohistone protein complexes that folded up DNA to make a chromosome. How did this thing fold up and then unfold and release its information? And I was really fascinated, but I made a tremendous discovery in the laboratory that I was ill-prepared to discover. I discovered that I absolutely love studying science, and I didn't really like doing it. So 2 years into a wonderful program with a full scholarship and a complete ride from NIH, I resigned. Which is not an easy thing to do. But I could tell that my heart was drawn and my personhood, my skills, were really in a different kind of laboratory, the laboratory of the phenomenology of human relationship. So I was still interested in how things became what they were, how things would fold up and unfold and release information, but it was more in the venue of human relationships. And so I switched fields and got degrees in psychology to go with the biology degrees, and that's how I ended up in behavioral medicine. Specifically, I started working in cancer care. And I'm telling you this story because in working with cancer patients, I worked for many, many years full-time with people who are dying. So I'm a Ph.D. clinical psychologist. I've never spent one day of my life in a psychiatric hospital, but I've spent years in medical surgical floors. And in the process of working with people who were facing life and death, there were questions that they were asking me that I couldn't answer psychologically. The psychological work I did with them was very useful in healing. But they were asking questions that had to do with the soul, as it were. Not specifically religious, but something that was, so I went looking further. And since I didn't want to offer something particularly religious, but I wanted to touch the spiritual question that people had, and I'd been trained in medical hypnosis, biofeedback, visualization. I worked with Carl and Stephanie Simonton, who were lecturers in the Mind Science Foundation in the past, and working with cancer patients. And so I began to look to the East because meditation was a central practice. And when I began to study Buddhism, I realized I'd found my place because the Buddha had only one question. How do we create suffering and how can we end it? And I was in the suffering business. And so I knew that this was a spiritual path, or at least something that would inform what I was doing. I trained as a psychotherapist and also as a student of Buddhism, and then later as a Zen Buddhist priest, became a teacher. And I began to realize two really important things that launch our story. Number one, as a psychotherapist, I noticed that there are people who had amazing insight, tremendous psychological awareness. They understood a lot of what went on inside of them, and they could make big changes in their lives. And many of them were stuck in self-reflection and self-identification and no way to get out of it. Do you understand what I mean? They could see themselves, think about themselves, understand themselves, but without a non-dual practice of the mind, they were always locked in self. Now, also, I've spent years in Buddhist temples and monasteries training, and I found some of my colleagues and teachers had amazing clarity. They understood the Dharma, or the Buddhist teachings. They could teach it, and yet when they sat on the meditation cushion and pain from the trauma of their childhood, or discomfort with the person that they were sitting next to came up, they had no idea what to do with it. And just sitting more didn't seem to help. But what I began to find in this dual training is that if a person could utilize the tools of psychology and psychotherapy and utilize the practices that the Buddha taught, suddenly there was a capacity to touch both sides. And so that's what I call the double helix, since I was a biological scientist, of growing up and waking up. And in that double helix, the thing that holds together these two streams is actual love. So one side of the helix is this issue of growing up. How can we become intimate with our lives and in the relationships around us and become full as a human being? We go from childhood, or infancy into childhood, childhood into adolescence, then to adulthood, and from a psychological point of view, that's usually where it ends. You're a grown-up. Except that's not actually where it ends. There's more to the story of growing up. And that more to the story has something to do with what it means to wake up.